The moment she stepped from the shadows to save the Obsidian Throne, she sealed her fate. For 12 years, Linnea had been a ghost in the royal palace, the invisible woman who came in the dead of night to polish the great, dark seat of power, a throne she was not worthy to even look at directly. He was Lord Valerius, the Winter King, a man carved from ice and shadow, so ancient his heart was said to have stopped beating centuries ago. She was a nobody, a failed artisan rejected by the guild and dismissed as a mere cleaner. But what no one knew was that her hands didn't just polish the stone, they listened to it. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the throne was not the only ancient thing in that hall to feel the stirrings of a forgotten warmth. If you believe that being truly seen is the most powerful magic of all, type Keeper below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know about the silence. Linnea's life was built of it. The silence of her small, cold attic room. The silence of the grand palace corridors. After midnight, when the courtiers had all staggered off to their warm beds, leaving behind only the scent of spilled wine and guttering candle wax. And most of all, the deep, resonant silence of the North Hall, where the great Obsidian Throne sat upon its dais like a shard of frozen night. For 12 years, this had been her world. By day, she was nothing, a woman who bought her bread with the meager wages of a palace servant, her face and name forgotten by all who passed her. But by night, she was the Keeper. It was not her official title, of course. Her official title was third-tier domestic night staff. Her duties were listed as maintenance of the North Hall statuary and ceremonial furniture. Janitorial work, Mister Albright, the head of the Artisans Guild, had called it, his lip curling in disdain. He'd said it on the day he had personally rejected her application to the guild. She had presented her work, a series of small, intricately polished geodes, their crystalline hearts revealed with a skill that had taken her a lifetime to learn. He had barely glanced at them. "This is cleaning, girl," he'd said, his voice loud enough for the other apprentices to hear and snicker. "You have a knack for polishing, I'll grant you, a fine skill for a housemaid. It is not art." The memory was a sharp stone in her heart, one she could never quite polish smooth. The rejection had closed every door to her. No one would commission her, no one would apprentice her. The only work she could find that allowed her to touch stone was this, the midnight polishing of a throne no one else dared to handle. The Obsidian Throne was not mere furniture, it was legend. Carved from a single massive piece of volcanic glass, hauled from the heart of a frozen mountain, it was said to be the anchor of the kingdom. It was the seat of Lord Valerius, the enigmatic ruler of these northern lands. He was a man surrounded by his own winter, a figure of daunting stillness and unnerving authority. Linnea had only ever seen him from a distance, a tall, dark shape in a hall full of bowing heads, his presence sucking the warmth from the very air. The staff whispered stories about him. They said the candles flickered and dimmed when he passed. They said his shadow sometimes seemed to move on its own, detaching from his heels to stretch and pool in the corners of the room. They said no one had ever seen him eat, or sleep, or shiver from the cold that clung to the castle stones like ivy. Linnea didn't know about all that. What she knew was the throne. Under her hands, the stone was not dead. It had moods. Some nights it was sullen and cold, drinking the warmth from her fingers and giving nothing back. On other nights, it felt almost alive, humming with a low, deep vibration that only she seemed to feel. She learned its geography like the back of her own hand, the faint, web-like cracks near the base, the spot on the right armrest that was always a degree colder than the rest, the subtle shift in texture where an ancient repair had been made. She talked to it, her whispers lost in the cavernous hall. She told it about her day, about the price of rye bread, about the sneer from a passing courtier. And in the resonant silence she felt, not an answer, but a sense of being heard. In a world that looked right through her, this cold, hard thing was the only witness to her existence. The night it all changed began with a cacophony of noise, a violation of her silent world. Lord Valerius was hosting a reception for a visiting southern duke, a peacock of a man named Moray. The North Hall, usually her solitary sanctuary, was ablaze with 1,000 candles and filled with the shrill laughter and loud boasts of the court. Linnea was hidden away, tasked with waiting in a small service alcove just off the main hall, in case of a spill or some other menial disaster. From her sliver of a view, she could see the dais. She could see Lord Valerius on his throne. He was exactly as the stories painted him, impossibly still, a figure of absolute control in a room teeming with chaos. He wore black, as he always did, the severe cut of his coat making him seem sharper and darker than the men around him. While others gesticulated and laughed, he simply watched, his dark eyes moving over the crowd with an unnerving lack of expression. The temperature around the dais was visibly colder. Several ladies in their fine silks were rubbing their arms, their breath misting slightly in the air. Then it happened. Duke Moray, florid and drunk, was holding forth with a goblet of dark red wine. He gestured grandly, his arm swinging wide. The goblet slipped. A crimson arc flew through the air, and the entire contents spattered directly onto the right arm of the Obsidian Throne. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. A horrified silence fell, more profound and terrible than any Linnea had ever known. The wine was not just wine. It was a special vintage from the Duke's own lands, notoriously acidic. It began to sizzle, a faint, sickening hiss as it ate into the polished surface of the ancient stone. Panic erupted. Courtiers cried out. Servants scurried forward and then stopped, terrified, not knowing what to do. Wiping it would only smear the acid. Dousing it with water might crack the supercooled stone. Mr. Albright, the guildmaster, pushed his way forward, his face pale with sweat. He looked at the damage, his expression one of pure horror and helplessness. He, the master artisan, had no idea how to fix this. He looked up at Lord Valerius, stammering apologies, but the Lord of the North was not looking at him. His gaze had lifted, sweeping past the panicked crowd, past the fuming stain, and into the shadows of the service corridor. His eyes, dark as the throne itself, locked directly onto Linnea's. In that moment, she felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear, the years of feeling small and invisible, it all fell away. All she could see was the stone. The stone was in pain. Her stone. She didn't think. She acted. She pushed out of the alcove, her worn work apron still tied around her waist. A guard moved to block her, but she slipped past him, her movements quick and sure. The crowd parted before her as if she were a phantom, their shocked faces turning to follow her path. She didn't look at any of them. She didn't look at the Duke, or Mister Albright, or even at the silent king on his throne. She had eyes only for the sizzling stain. Reaching the dais, she fell to her knees, not in supplication, but in the familiar posture of her work. From the deep pockets of her apron, she pulled out her tools. Not the simple cloths and waxes for polishing, but her private kit. a small leather roll containing powdered limestone, a vial of refined oil of birch, and a set of doeskin pads. Her hands moved with a certainty that silenced the room completely. She sprinkled the fine white powder over the spill, neutralizing the acid. The sizzling stopped. Then, with a soft cloth, she carefully, gently, blotted the mess, lifting it from the surface without smearing it. The stone beneath was left with a dull, ugly scar, its perfect blackness marred by a cloudy white etch. A murmur went through the crowd. The immediate danger was gone, but the damage was done. The throne was defaced, but Linnea wasn't finished. She took a clean doeskin pad, added a few drops of the birch oil, and began to work on the scar. She moved in small, patient circles, her touch impossibly light. It was the work of hours, not minutes, but even in the first few moments, something began to change. The rhythm of her movements was hypnotic. The only sound in the vast hall was the whisper of leather on stone. She lost all track of time, all awareness of the 100 pairs of eyes fixed on her. It was just her and the stone. She felt the familiar, faint hum beneath her palm, a weak and distressed vibration. "It's all right," she murmured, her voice too low for anyone but herself to hear. "I'm here. I've got you." Slowly, miraculously, the cloudy scar began to recede. The dullness gave way to a soft sheen, then a deeper luster. The blackness returned, not as a void, but as a thing of infinite depth. She was not just polishing the surface, she was coaxing the life back into it, drawing the stone's own inner light back to the place of its wounding. When she finally lifted her hand, the arm of the throne was perfect, more than perfect. The spot glowed with a depth and richness that made the rest of the throne look tired. There was no scar, no mark. It was as if the spill had never happened. A collective breath was released by the stunned court. Linnea, her work done, finally became aware of where she was. She was kneeling at the feet of Lord Valerius, in the center of the royal court, her hands stained with oil and powder, her heart hammered against her ribs. She had broken every rule. She was a servant. She had touched the throne. She had acted without permission. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the punishment she was sure would come. Banishment, imprisonment. A voice low and resonant as a cello string cut through the silence. It was a voice that held the cold of 1,000 winters, yet it was utterly devoid of anger. "You may all leave," Lord Valerius said. The command was absolute. There was no argument, no hesitation. The courtiers, including the ashen-faced Duke and the bewildered Mister Albright, bowed hastily and began to file out of the hall, their whispers echoing as they retreated. Within a minute, the vast space was empty, save for the two of them. Linnea remained on her knees, her head bowed, her world having shrunk to the cold flagstones beneath her. "Rise," the voice commanded. She trembled, but she obeyed, getting to her feet slowly. She kept her eyes down, fixed on the hem of his black coat. She could feel the chill emanating from him, a palpable wave of cold that had nothing to do with the night air. "Look at me." It took every ounce of her courage, but she lifted her head. She met the eyes of the Vampire King. They were not black, as she had thought. They were a deep, dark crimson, like old wine held up to a dying fire. They held no malice, only an unnerving, ancient intelligence, an intensity that felt as if it were seeing not just her face, but the entire 12 years of her silent devotion. "What is your name?" he asked. His tone was not a question, but a demand for a fact. "Linnea, my lord," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His gaze dropped from her face to her hands. She instinctively tried to hide them, suddenly conscious of the calluses, the stained fingers, the broken nails. They were the hands of a laborer, not a lady. He moved, stepping down from the dais. He was taller than she had imagined, and his stillness was so absolute it was unnerving. He stopped directly in front of her, and to her utter shock, he reached out and took one of her hands. His touch was not the clammy cold of death she might have expected. It was the deep, profound cold of marble from a crypt, of water from the bottom of a well. It was a clean, ancient cold that seemed to hum with latent power. He turned her hand over, his long, pale fingers tracing the calluses on her palm with a strange, analytical curiosity. "These are not the hands of a janitor," he stated, his crimson eyes lifting to meet hers again. The statement hung in the air, a direct contradiction of Mr. Albright's dismissive words, the very words that had defined her life for so long. He saw her. He saw the skill, not the station. He released her hand, and the absence of his touch left her skin feeling strangely warm and empty. "You will no longer be polishing statues," he said, his voice leaving no room for discussion. "From this night on, you will work only for me. You will be housed in the royal wing. Your concern is now the throne, and only the throne." Linnea could only stare, speechless. The royal wing was a place she had only ever glimpsed from a distance, the sanctum of the king and his most trusted advisors. It was a world away from her attic room and the service corridors. My lord," she stammered, finding her voice. "I don't understand. I am just a polisher." A flicker of something, not quite a smile but a shadow of one, touched his lips. "No," he said softly, the sound a strange intimacy in the vast, empty hall. "You are not." He turned and gestured toward a dark archway she had never seen used. "Your new quarters will be prepared. My chamberlain will show you the way. We will begin our work tomorrow night." And with that, he swept from the hall, his shadow clinging to his heels like a loyal hound before melting into the greater darkness of the corridor. Linnea was left standing alone before the gleaming, silent throne, the world she had known for 12 years shattered in a single, impossible hour. Her new rooms were larger than the entire floor of the boarding house where she had lived. They were furnished with dark, heavy wood and rich, somber tapestries. A fire had been lit in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light that felt alien after her years in the cold. But the most astonishing thing was the window. It was a great, arched casement that looked out not onto a grimy city alley, but onto the king's private night garden, a silent, moon-drenched world of silver-leafed trees and pale, night-blooming flowers. She was given new clothes, simple but finely made dresses, soft wool in shades of gray and deep blue. She was brought a meal on a silver tray, though she could barely touch it. It was all too much, too fast. She felt like a stray sparrow brought into a gilded cage. The following night, as the moon rose high over the silent palace, a soft knock came at her door. It was the chamberlain, a man so old and dry he looked like a walking piece of parchment. He led her without a word through a series of private corridors, their footsteps echoing on the cold stone. They did not go to the North Hall. Instead, he led her to the king's private library. It was a space that stole her breath. 2 stories high, walled with books from floor to ceiling, with a rolling ladder and a massive globe in the center. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax. Lord Valerius was standing by the great hearth, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, watching the flames. The firelight cast his sharp, aristocratic features in a play of light and shadow. The candles in the room seemed to burn lower in his presence, their flames pulling toward him as if in tribute. "Come in, Linnea," he said, without turning. She stepped into the room, and the chamberlain closed the heavy oak doors behind her, the sound of the latch clicking into place feeling dreadfully final. Lord Valerius turned to face her. "Do you know what that throne is?" he asked, his voice quiet. "It is your seat of power, my lord," she answered, her voice small in the vast room. "The heart of the North." "It is more than that," he said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. She sat, perching on the edge of the velvet cushion. "It is a conduit, an anchor. It focuses the power that holds this kingdom together. The cold, the dark, the silence. It is tied to me, and I to it. And it is failing." Linnea stared at him. "Failing? But it's stone." "A stone can die, just as a man can," he replied, his crimson eyes fixed on her. "It can lose its resonance, become inert. For the last century, it has been growing weaker. The fissures you have felt, the cold spots, they are not signs of age. They are signs of decay. The incident with the wine was merely a symptom of a much deeper sickness." He began to pace before the fire, his movements fluid and silent. "I have had the greatest minds, the most skilled artisans examine it. They see only a surface. They polish it. They seal the visible cracks. But they cannot feel its heart growing cold. They are like physicians treating a fever while the soul departs." He stopped and looked directly at her. "But you felt it. I have watched you on the rare occasions I have been in the hall at night. I have seen how you touch it. I have heard you speak to it. Last night, when you healed the scar, you did not simply repair the surface. You called to it, and it answered you." The revelation settled over her, both terrifying and validating. He had been watching her. Her secret, solitary communion with the throne had not been secret at all. "The throne is dying, Linnea," he said, his voice dropping lower. "And if it dies, so does the magic that holds the shadows at bay and keeps the endless winter from consuming these lands. So do I." The quiet admission of his own mortality, or whatever passed for it in his long existence, was the most shocking thing he had said yet. He, the immortal Lord of the North, was vulnerable. "I need more than a polisher," he continued. "I need a healer, someone who can listen to the stone, find the source of its sickness, and mend it from the inside out. I believe you are that person." Here it was, the reason for her sudden elevation. She was not a guest. She was a tool, a highly specialized, last-ditch tool. A part of her should have felt used, a familiar sting of being valued only for her utility, but another, larger part of her felt a profound sense of purpose. This was not about seeking the approval of a guild or proving her worth to men like Albright. This was about saving the one thing in the world that had ever truly seen her. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady. Relief, faint but unmistakable, flickered in his ancient eyes. "I need you to work, every night. I will give you access to all my knowledge, to texts on geology, on resonance, on the forgotten arts of the Earth-shapers. We will work together. You with your hands, I, with my senses. We will find the heart of the problem, and we will fix it. He was asking her to be his partner, not his servant. His partner. Would you have said yes, knowing the fate of a kingdom and of this ancient, lonely man rested on your tired, calloused hands? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not yet subscribed, please join us. Linnea looked at her own hands resting in her lap, the hands that a world of men had dismissed, and she thought of the cold, silent throne that had been her only friend. I will help you, she said, and so began their strange partnership. Every night, after the palace slept, they would meet in the North Hall. The great chamber was kept empty, the doors barred. It became their private world, lit by a few candelabras that cast long, dancing shadows. At first, their nights were filled with a tense, professional silence. Linnea would work, her focus entirely on the throne. She didn't just polish it now. She tended to it. She used poultices made from rare clays and powdered minerals he provided, materials described in the ancient, leather-bound books he brought her from his library. She learned to read the stone not just with her hands, but with her whole body, attuning herself to its subtle vibrations. Valerius would sit on the steps of the dais, watching her. He never interfered, never offered instruction unless she asked. He was a silent, brooding presence, the chill that emanated from him a constant reminder of his nature. But Linnea found she didn't mind the cold. It was a clean, dry cold, like a crisp winter night, and it felt peaceful, familiar. She began to talk to him as she had once talked to the throne, her voice soft in the quiet hall. She told him what she was feeling from the stone, a deep, thrumming ache near the base, a brittleness along the back that felt like old fear. He would listen, his crimson gaze never leaving her, and then he would respond, not with platitudes, but with knowledge. That corresponds to the great quake of the 4th century, he might say, his voice a low rumble. The fault line runs directly beneath this hall. The throne absorbed the shock, preventing the castle from collapsing. It must have sustained a deep internal fracture then. He spoke of history as if it were yesterday. He talked about the kings and queens who had sat on that throne, their ambitions, their fears. He had known them all. He was a living library, a vessel of centuries. Linnea found herself captivated, not by the vampire king of legend, but by the lonely historian who had watched the world change from his cold, silent seat. One night, as she was applying a paste of powdered jet and silver, her hand, slick with oil, slipped on the curved armrest. She lost her balance, starting to fall backward off the dais. Before she could even cry out, he was there. He moved not like a man, but like a whisper of smoke. One moment he was on the steps, the next he was behind her, his hand closing around her arm to steady her. The entire motion was silent, fluid, and impossibly fast. His grip was firm, his fingers wrapping around her forearm. She felt that profound, earthy cold sink into her skin, but this time it was coupled with an undeniable strength. She looked up into his face, so close to her own, and saw a flicker of something raw in his eyes, a fierce, protective instinct that startled her. "Be careful," he said, his voice a low growl. The sound vibrated through her, a strange warmth in the center of the cold. He held her for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze searching her face. It was the first time they had touched since that first night. The contact was electric, a jolt of connection that had nothing to do with the stone. He released her slowly, and his hand fell away, but she could still feel the chill of his fingers imprinted on her skin. After that night, the space between them began to shrink. He no longer sat on the steps, but on the dais itself, just a few feet from where she worked. Sometimes, he would read to her from the ancient texts, his resonant voice giving life to the forgotten words. He learned the rhythm of her work, knowing when to hand her a fresh cloth or a different tool without her having to ask. She learned the landscape of his silence. She could distinguish the contemplative silence from the weary one, the watchful silence from the lonely one. She found herself wanting to fill the lonely silences, not with chatter, but with a quiet companionship. One evening, he found her not in the North Hall, but in the night garden, staring up at the moon. "The stone is tired tonight," she said, without turning. It needed to rest. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar pool of cold in the mild air. "And you? Are you not tired, Linnea?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "But it's a good tired. It's the first time my work has ever mattered." He was silent for a long moment, watching the pale, ghostly petals of a moonflower unfurl in the darkness. "To be seen," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "It is a powerful thing. For some of us, it has been a very long time." In that moment, she understood. He was not just talking about her. He, the feared and revered Lord, was just as invisible. The world saw the power, the title, the legend. They did not see the man, the being, who carried the weight of centuries on his shoulders, alone. She felt a sudden, fierce surge of compassion for him. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand on his forearm, over the black wool of his coat. "You are not alone now," she said, her voice firm. He went utterly still. He looked down at her small, calloused hand resting on his arm, and when he looked back up at her, his crimson eyes were burning with an emotion so intense it made her breath catch. He slowly lifted his own hand and covered hers, his cold fingers lacing with her warm ones. He didn't say a word, but in his touch, she felt 1,000 years' arms of solitude begin to crack. But their growing closeness did not go unnoticed. The palace was a place of whispers, and the elevation of a low-born servant to the king's private confidence was a scandal that fueled gossip in every corner. No one was more incensed than Mister Albright. His humiliation on the night of the reception had festered into a poisonous obsession. He saw Linnea not as a skilled artisan, but as a charlatan, a witch who had somehow enchanted the king. Her success was an indictment of his own failure, a mockery of the guild and its rigid hierarchies. He found a willing ally in Duke Moray, who had been publicly shamed by the incident and privately reprimanded by Lord Valerius. The Duke was convinced the king was losing his mind, falling under the spell of a common girl. They began to conspire, their whispers dark and urgent in the candlelit back rooms of the city. "He keeps her with him every night, alone in the throne room," Albright seethed, his face mottled with rage. "She has bewitched him. We must expose her for the fraud she is." Their plan was simple and cruel. They would create a flaw in the throne so great that she could not possibly fix it. They would break it, and in the king's ensuing rage, her spell would be broken, and Albright's authority would be restored. They chose a night when they knew the king was occupied with matters of state, a rare meeting with his military commanders that would last until dawn. With a bribed guard turning a blind eye, Albright and Duke Moray, along with 2 of Moray's thuggish guards, slipped into the darkened North Hall. Albright carried a heavy, sharp-edged geologist's hammer. His eyes gleamed with malice as he approached the throne, which seemed to absorb the moonlight, giving off a soft, internal luster from Linnea's nightly care. "Look at it," Albright spat. She's done nothing but polish it. A parlor trick. He raised the hammer, intending to strike the throne's central crest, a blow that would surely shatter the ancient obsidian. But he never got the chance. From the deepest shadows in the corners of the hall, darkness began to move. It wasn't the passive absence of light, but an active, predatory presence. The shadows pooled and stretched, flowing across the floor like spilled ink. A sudden, supernatural cold dropped the temperature in the room by 20 degrees, extinguishing half the candles in a single, silent puff. The Duke's guards froze, their eyes wide with primal fear. "What is this sorcery?" Moray stammered, backing away. A voice cut through the chilling air, calm and deadly. "She is not the one who deals in sorcery, Duke." Lord Valerius stepped out of the shadows behind the throne, not from any visible door or corridor, but as if he had been woven from the darkness itself. Beside him stood Linnea, her face pale but her expression resolute. She had been with him in the library when his shadows had whispered their warning. "Lord Valerius," Albright gasped, lowering the hammer, his face draining of all color. We were just inspecting the throne. We feared the girl's amateur methods might have caused some damage." Valerius's eyes, glowing with a faint crimson light in the gloom, fixed on the hammer in Albright's hand. "With that?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. He moved. It was the same impossible speed Linnea had witnessed before, but this time it was not meant to save, but to menace. He crossed the vast space in the blink of an eye, a blur of black cloth and chilling intent. He stopped an inch from Albright, snatching the hammer from his grasp. The metal groaned as Valerius's fingers tightened, crushing the thick iron head of the hammer as if it were soft clay. He let the ruined tool drop to the floor with a dull clang. Duke Moray let out a small, choked cry of terror. "You have mistaken my patience for weakness," Valerius said, his voice a low snarl that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. His shadow detached from his feet, rising up behind him like a great dark wave, its edges indistinct and menacing. "You have threatened my kingdom. You have threatened my keeper." He turned his glowing eyes on Albright, and the guildmaster fell to his knees, trembling uncontrollably. "Forgive me, my lord. I didn't know." Valerius seemed poised to deliver a terrible judgment, his power rolling off him in palpable waves of cold fury. But then Linnea stepped forward. She placed a gentle hand on his arm. The gesture was shockingly intimate, and the effect was immediate. The towering shadow behind him receded slightly, and the killing cold in the room lessened. He looked down at her, and the crimson fire in his eyes banked, just for a moment. She did not want him to kill for her. She did not want to be a damsel whose honor was avenged with blood. She wanted to stand on her own. She turned her gaze to the pathetic, trembling man on the floor. She looked at Mister Albright, the man who had broken her spirit 12 years ago, and she felt not hatred, but a hollow pity. "You were wrong about me," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority no one in the room had ever heard from her before. "You said my work was janitorial. You said I couldn't create, only clean. You only ever saw the surface. You never thought to look deeper." She turned from him and walked to the throne. She placed her right hand flat against its back, over the very heart of the stone. She closed her eyes, shutting out the fearful men, shutting out everything but the deep, humming presence she had come to know so well. She reached for it with her mind, with her spirit, with the quiet strength he had shown her she possessed. "Show them," she whispered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a soft light began to pulse from within the obsidian, deep beneath her palm. It started as a faint violet glow, then grew stronger, a slow, steady beat like a living heart. The light spread through the throne, tracing the network of internal fissures not as cracks, but as luminous veins. The entire throne began to glow, filling the North Hall with a soft, ethereal light that was both beautiful and terrifyingly powerful. The hum she had always felt became an audible, resonant tone, a sound of immense age and power reawakening. It was undeniable proof. She was not a polisher. She was a conduit, a partner to the ancient stone. Duke Moray and his men stared, their faces masks of awe and terror. Albright simply wept, his face buried in his hands, his entire worldview shattered. Linnea held the connection for another moment, letting the power flow through her. A circuit completed between her, the throne, and the silent king who watched her with an expression of fierce, unholy pride. Then, she gently broke the link. The light receded, pulling back into the heart of the stone, leaving it gleaming in the moonlight, looking stronger and more alive than it had in 1,000 years. She turned back to face the room. She was no longer just Linnea, the servant. She was the woman who had woken the heart of the mountain. Valerius's judgment, when it came, was cold and swift. He did not execute them. He did something far more devastating. He stripped Duke Moray of his titles and lands, banishing him to the frozen wastes of the far north. He didn't banish Albright. Instead, he decreed that the Artisans Guild was to be disbanded, its charter revoked. Its members would now have to petition for royal patronage on an individual basis, their work judged not by a corrupt master, but by a new standard. His final words to Albright were the cruelest cut of all. "You will not be considered for patronage," he said, his voice flat and final. "Your eye is blind to true artistry. You will live out your days as what you are, a man who can no longer practice his craft." He left him with nothing. The next week, Lord Valerius called a full and formal gathering of the court. The North Hall was once again filled with the nobility of the kingdom, but this time the mood was not festive. It was tense, uncertain. They had all heard the rumors of what had happened, of the Duke's banishment and the Guild's dissolution. They whispered and watched, wondering what would come next. Valerius sat upon the Obsidian Throne, which seemed to pulse with a new, dark energy. He was silent, watching the assembly, letting the tension build. Linnea stood in the shadows near the dais, as she once had, but now she was not hiding. She was waiting. Finally he spoke. "There has been a sickness in this court," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "A sickness of pride and blindness, a tendency to value station over substance and title over talent." His gaze swept the room, and many lords and ladies shifted uncomfortably. He then turned his eyes to the corner where the former members of the Artisans Guild stood, huddled together, their faces pale. "For too long," he continued, "we have allowed our judgment to be clouded. We have overlooked the treasures in our very midst." His crimson gaze found Linnea in the shadows. "Linnea," he commanded, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Come here." A path cleared for her once again. Every eye was on her as she walked toward the dais, her simple wool dress a stark contrast to the silks and jewels of the court. She walked with her head held high, her steps even and sure. The whispers died into a profound silence. She stopped at the foot of the dais and curtsied, as protocol demanded, but Valerius shook his head. He stood, a towering, formidable figure, and descended the steps to her. He took her hand, his cold fingers closing around hers in a gesture of unmistakable possession. "There is no queen of this kingdom," he said, his voice ringing with power. "There has not been one for 1,000 years. The throne will not accept one." The court gasped. Was he about to defy tradition? "But the throne," he continued, turning to look at the glowing obsidian seat, "has a heart, and that heart has chosen its keeper." He led her up the steps of the dais, turning her to face the stunned court. In front of everyone who had ever dismissed her, ignored her, or sneered at her, he raised her hand. "I present to you Linnea, keeper of the Heartstone. Her word on matters of the kingdom's soul is my word. Her safety is my command. She will stand beside me." He did not crown her. He did something far more intimate, far more shocking. He sat back down upon the great obsidian throne, the seat of all power, and then, with a deliberate and possessive grace, he pulled her down onto his lap. The collective shock of the court was a physical force. He settled her against his chest, one arm wrapping securely around her waist, claiming her in the most primal and public way possible. She was not his consort. She was part of his power, seated with him on the very anchor of the realm. She could feel the deep, steady hum of the throne through him, a circuit of power flowing from the stone, through the vampire king, and into her. He leaned his head down, his lips brushing against her ear, his voice a private whisper for her alone. "They see you now," he murmured. And they did. They saw her, seated on the throne of power, held in the arms of their immortal ruler. They saw her not as a servant, but as the woman who had healed the kingdom's heart. And as one, the great and the proud, the lords and the ladies, the artisans and the warriors, all sank into a deep, deferential bow. 1 year passed. The North Hall was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was a peaceful, resonant silence, the feeling of a home that was whole. The obsidian throne no longer had cold spots. It emanated a steady, faint warmth and a deep, contented hum. Linnea stood with Valerius in the high tower of his private observatory, looking out at the snow-covered kingdom sleeping under a sky full of stars. The chill that always surrounded him no longer felt cold to her. It was simply his air, as natural and familiar as breathing. She had her own set of keys now, keys to the library, the gardens, the observatory. She had her own work table in his study, covered in stones and texts. She was not a prisoner, nor a queen. She was his partner in all things. He came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, content in his cold, solid embrace. "Time moves differently for me," he said quietly, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "This year with you has felt like a single, perfect breath after an eternity of holding one." She knew what he was leading to. They had spoken of it before, in hushed tones in the dead of night. Her mortality, the bright, fierce, fragile flame of her life against the endless, cold expanse of his. "I will never force it upon you," he said, his voice serious. "The choice to share my eternity must be yours, and yours alone. When you are ready, if you are ever ready." He paused, his grip tightening almost imperceptibly. "I have waited centuries for a heart that could hear the stone, Linnea. I can wait for you." She smiled, a soft, genuine smile. She reached up and placed her hand over his on her waist. She thought of the lonely girl in the attic room, the invisible woman polishing a cold stone in the dark. That girl was a ghost, a distant memory. The woman she was now was seen. She was valued. She was loved. "I am already home," she whispered. He said nothing, but she felt the truth of his answer in the way he held her. He lowered his head, his face burying in her hair, inhaling her scent as if it were life itself. Then, with a tenderness that defied his fearsome nature, he reached up and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his thumb grazing her skin. A simple, human gesture from a being who was so much more. And in that small, quiet touch, Linnea felt the promise of an eternity she would gladly choose. For more stories where quiet strength conquers ancient loneliness, and where being overlooked becomes the source of ultimate power, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed when you learned the fate of the kingdom rested on your hands? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.